Welcome into a brand new edition of the Sports Hub Patriots Podcast Training Camp Edition, coming to you after day 12 of Patriots Training Camp, 2.5 weeks in here. I'm Alex Barth from 98.5thesportshub.com, and we're joined today for kind of a double episode by the voice of the New England Patriots, Bob Socci. He calls the games on 98.5 The Sports Hub. He'll have the call along with Scott Zolak on Thursday night when the Patriots play their preseason opener against the Texans. So, Bob, perfect chance to kind of go into today's practice a little bit, but also I want to get your thoughts on what you're expecting Thursday night, what we can look for Thursday night when this team finally plays a game.
Well, Alex, my expectations have changed a lot in the last few days. I thought early in the week that we might see some of the regulars, but I think the state of the offensive line eliminates a lot of the guys just by nature of their status right now, being injured and whatnot. And I thought to take it a step back for a moment, I thought that we might see some more regulars because I didn't anticipate any of those guys. I don't anticipate a lot of those guys playing after the joint practices the next couple of weeks. But thinking has totally changed after watching the last 2 days of practice and reassessing where they are on the offensive line right now, truly in a state of flux. Though Trent Brown, which I'm sure we'll dive into, was out there a little bit today. So he's slowly working his way back, whether it's from a minor injury, a hold in, or whatever it is, a combination of all the above and more that has really kept him off to the side for the most part to this stage. But I think as Bill Belichick answered today, like the rest of the NFL in these first preseason games, expectations are we're going to see a lot of players who are either on the bubble, perhaps, who are trying to fight their way to the other side for roster consideration. Right now, looking on the outside, looking from the outside, hoping that they can shine on Thursday night and be considered on the inside at some point in time as the 53-man roster projections, become, I think, a little bit closer to on target these next few weeks, especially after the joint practices. But I don't anticipate a lot of the guys that I think people are most familiar with. But I do think we're going to see some guys that people are going to be excited about when they watch them, and people are hearing and reading about, and speaking specifically of the young wide receiver, Demario Douglas, and I would even throw Kayshon Boutte in there as well.
Yeah, it like you said, we got that feeling at practice. Just to go back to kind of what you said at the beginning, I thought you summed up kind of the state of everything perfectly there. But these last two practices, I've been covering training camp practices now for this is my 6th year. I don't remember seeing them go into full game prep mode at this point in training camp as they have the last 2 days. And I'm talking about you're on both sides going off the card. They're going full scout team, all of that. We saw today a group of players, presumed offensive starters, Mac Jones among them, off to the side. I can't help but pair that with comments from Bill Belichick and Bailey Zappi earlier in the week. Bill Belichick saying that they have everything installed pretty much that they're going to install. And then Bailey Zappi actually saying that he feels the offense is maybe a little ahead of schedule. Do you think that maybe these game prep practices are a sign that they're ahead of schedule? And do you think that maybe the projected usage that we're not going to see some of these guys in the preseason game could also be a sign that they're ahead of where they thought they'd be at this point?
Yeah, I think that both could be. And I think as well, it's been interesting to see the contrast between some of the physical practices and the pads that we saw this past week as opposed to in years past. And I'm going to go back prior to last year. Tackling to the ground. That's not something that I recall seeing very much of unless it was by accident. A guy was overzealous, for the better part of the time that I've been watching training camp practices. And there was some thought, I know Mike Reese floated this out there, that perhaps it's a sign of the sense of urgency they have in order to get off to a good start, being physically aggressive even in these contact padded practices. And I think for the fans who don't go to training camp, when you hear padded practices and contact, again, often in the past, there is contact, but it's not like you see in a game. But I thought there were a couple of practices this past week where we really saw guys hit pretty hard out there. And that was even after the practice when Bill Belichick told the players, cautioning them to look out for one another. And so we switched from that to, as you say now this week, at least the last couple of days, kind of this game prep mode. Yesterday, I think there was a school of thought that not only was Malik Cunningham the fourth quarterback, let's say right now, a guy that has been going through this process of trying to make a position switch from quarterback full-time in college to wide receiver, returner potentially as a professional thus far in the spring and the summer. He ran a lot of the offense off the cards. And I think there was a school of thought that, not only was it to prepare him for Thursday night, but also that could be his role during the course of the season as they scout team quarterback. The Patriots are going to face a lot of quarterbacks, very athletic, very fast, like him. But seeing him out there again today, and as you mentioned, the other guys working off cards today, it seems to me it's really more about preparing this team for the game on Thursday, but also maybe, too, getting everybody into that mode so that they can be prepared on September 10th a little bit better than they have been in the past to get off to a good start.
And I think there's probably some people thinking, all right, well, still they're ahead of schedule, but after where they were last year, I want to see them get going. I want to see guys kind of get used to working together. The other thing that stood out the last couple of days is where the chemistry's at between some of those key offensive players. Mac Jones with Juju Smith-Schuster Mike Gesicki's the big one for me. I actually asked Mike Gesicki about it yesterday, and you're never going to hear a guy say, no, I'm not on the same page as the starting quarterback. But you can kind of read when an answer is lip service and when it's genuine. And I asked Gesicki, and he immediately pointed to a specific play. He said, I ran an over midway through practice, and where Mac put the ball to adjust for the rain and the wind was exactly where I wanted it. And I went up to him after, and we talked about how we figured that out. Like that, to me, he truly believes that the chemistry is getting there. And you're seeing it with some of these plays he's making. He made what was probably the catch of camp today, a one-handed leaping catch up along the end line in practice, got both feet down in bounds. And that's another thing where I look at and I say, well, I'm not going to say that Mac Jones and some of these starters don't need game reps, but I remember last year going into the first preseason game, and it's so, we shouldn't be comparing it all to last year because the bar is so low, but you can't help but do it. And I remember going into the game last year, there was this prevailing take of, all right, well, it hasn't worked in practice, but let's see what it looks like against an opponent that maybe doesn't recognize it. This year, I feel very much like, yeah, they're trending in the right direction. Even if they don't get what would ultimately be probably, 2 or 3 drives together, I still feel like the momentum is there and they're in a good spot.
Well, here's the rub for me, though, because while I do think you're right, that looking at it macro level offensively, they're ahead of schedule where they were last year by leaps and bounds.
Yeah.
No pun intended after that catch by Gesicki, reminding me of a catch Gronkowski made some years ago against the Broncos, pass over the middle. And in Gronk's case, it was in front of the end zone. And around the 5-yard line, we had to reach back on a ball behind him and pull it in with one hand. Gesicki did it, as you mentioned, in the back of the end zone and landed just inside the end line. And even Jabril Peppers, who had good coverage on the play, looked like he was stunned in disbelief.
He was laughing a little bit. I was right there. I could see it.
Absolutely. Yeah. It was an incredible play, and Matt came racing over and immediately celebrated with Gesicki. But the rub for me is they're behind schedule up front. The 5 on the offensive line, as Dante Scarnecchia has said throughout his career as an offensive line guru, and even in retirement, 5 have to work as one. 5 have to see things through one set of eyes. And I thought it was interesting when Trent Brown met the media yesterday, he was asked about continuity in developing it and the lack of continuity thus far in training camp. And he said, well, we get a chance to hang around with one another, to paraphrase, off the field. So we're building some continuity in that way. But that's not the same, obviously, as being on the field. Right. 5 offensive linemen all going in the right direction, the same direction, on the right page. And that takes time. It takes repetition. And they just have not had the bodies available. And when you think about it, really, you've got 4 of the 5 guys. That's best case scenario. We know who they are. Trent Brown at left tackle, Cole Strange, David Andrews, Mike Owenu. Strange is bothered by this leg injury, a bit of a mystery thus far in camp. Owenu hasn't been seen at all, still on the pup list coming off the right ankle surgery. And then that 5th guy, that's a huge question mark right now, because to me, and I know to a lot of other people who know a lot better, there's reason to be concerned about the 2 guys right now that I think are at the head of that pack vying for that job, Riley Reif and Connor McDermott, because we've yet to see Calvin Anderson.
Yeah, I'd agree with everything you said. I guess in the sense of this game, I'm more kind of the mindset that Cole Strange, Mike Onwenu, probably Trent Brown wouldn't play anyway. So getting, Mac Jones on the field with guys who he's ultimately not going to play with, I don't know how much that does for the.
Well, that's why I think that's probably the right reason why, and maybe it's a strong consideration, if not the reason why he's not going to play.
I think that's a fair point, because you can't put him back there if you don't know you can get him protected. But I do hope, we talked about some projected starters won't play. You kind of alluded to the right tackle situation there, Calvin Anderson, Riley Reef. Those are two guys I really hope do play, because those are two guys that we need to see and they need to see in game reps, because this is still an open battle for the right tackle spot. Now, if Trent Brown's not healthy, do we see Riley Reef at right tackle, or is he going to be on the left side with McDermott on the right side, as we've seen in camp? I hope we at least see Reef some on the right side, even if he's playing on the left side too. But it's not, my point wasn't to say like he can sit all the starters. I think there's still guys that very much need to play, including some skill position players who I want to get to in a minute. But I definitely think that, McDermott and Reef are two guys who should play, because
I think we're going to see a lot of those two guys.
Yeah.
I don't think we should. I don't expect to see Trent Brown.
I don't either. But as you alluded to, those two guys are still massive question marks. I was on Felger and Mass today talking about it. And for all the talk about the quarterback situation and doubting Mac Jones this offseason and doubting the wide receiver group, which I don't think is, elite by any means, but I think it's good enough. If anything's going to undo this offense, it's going to be the tackle position. And I don't know that there's a way for them to improve on the group they have right now. I think it's probably a little too late for that, but just getting a better idea of what you have so you can figure out how much you're going to have to compensate for it, I think is a really important task for them in this preseason.
No question. And there are young guys who are going to probably end up playing at some point in time, if not right away, who are going to get valuable reps. And I'm thinking of Antonio Maffei, Cody Russi, Jake Andrews. The Patriots have needed to call upon, even when they've been very solid at offensive line throughout the years, there's always that need for Ted Karras to slide in and make some starts. And I'm not thinking about the year when David Andrews missed the season because of blood clots. I'm thinking about those years when maybe a guy gets banged up in a game, he's out for a week or two, perhaps there's a concussion issue that keeps somebody on the sideline, and they've had people that could go in and be adequate. James Ferentz has done, I think, more than a serviceable job as kind of that player on the interior in recent years at center or a guard. But they're going to need these young guys. I think the three that I mentioned, one of them, if not two of them, may wind up starting early on, depending on where Onwenu is, for example, coming off that ankle surgery.
And I think Maffei would be the guy you're talking about. Just me personally watching, he's more of a fit at right guard if Onwenu can't play, and he's probably been the most impressive of the three rookies, I would say. I think he's stood out the most. But it's a position where, again, Thursday night's going to be a big night for him, because there's only so much you can tell in the context of a practice. And when he gets in game action, and he's a guy that could play 3 quarters because he's going to play with the starters and he'll probably play with the backups. He's a guy I think we're going to learn a lot about coming up on Thursday night.
I would agree. And I'm really interested to see too, on the flip side of things, how some of the defensive guys who we've watched pretty much dominate these one-on-one reps the last few days and really the last couple of practice, the way I've seen it. Now, I don't think a lot of the regulars, we consider regulars, are going to play, but there's some young guys that have really, I think, come along in recent days on that side of the ball. I know you want to probably get to more on the offensive side, but I think both sides of that line of scrimmage, it's going to be really interesting on Thursday night, looking at the people we're going to see out there.
Well, we can bounce back and forth a little bit here, because I do want to get your thoughts on the defensive line, because that has been something, everybody I've had on every day I've done this podcast, a very common question I've asked, because I don't think anybody really has an answer to it right now. How much on both sides, how much of a grain of salt do you have to put on what we're seeing? Because you're watching starters essentially go against third string players. And should we be as excited about the defensive line as it's looked? Should we be as down on the offensive line as it's looked, knowing the personnel difficulties? And yeah, as much as it's true for the offensive line, I think on the defensive side of the ball, we finally get to see them against, I would assume, some semblance of a starting group. I know Titus Howard got hurt. Houston starting left tackle got hurt. I think it was yesterday or the day before that. But if they're starting CJ Stroud, I would imagine they're going to have as many offensive line starters as they can in the game. So it will be a really good measuring test for that group for a guy like Christian Barmore, who's had a strong start to camp. I would say Dietrich Wise, but he told us today he's not playing, so I guess he's not in here. But a guy like Anthony Jennings and even a rookie, Keon White, who's had a fantastic start, a fantastic few days here, getting to measure them maybe against a higher level of competition.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. And I think Barmore has been very impressive thus far. And I think the one thing that like you can differentiate when you look at the defensive lineman versus an offensive lineman, it's one thing to get to the quarterback when the offensive line isn't playing well, but it's the explosiveness that we've seen from Barmore, where he's almost been untouched by some guys who've had no chance to block him in the one-on-ones, for example. And so regardless of who he's going against, you see that explosion like we did at times when he was a rookie. And then there's some of the younger guys, too, that may not even make this team. A guy like Sam Roberts was around last year. The long arms, the leverage. Farms is another guy up front who's done some nice things of late. I've heard some people talking about him a bit. And we saw him last year as well, somebody in these preseason games. I think that's one of the things about the Pats in recent years. And this really goes back to when Trey Flowers kind of had that redshirt injury year as a rookie. They've found guys there that are more than serviceable. And there's some that are still bouncing around the NFL. When you start to look at rosters, we'll see Byron Cowart, for example, on the Texans on Thursday night. And there's a handful of guys around the league that, the Patriots have come up with, either been undrafted guys or maybe guys that were in their second tour of a training camp that come in. And so I think there's pretty good depth there up front defensively.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see, again, how to me, I just keep going back to they're going to be going to get, I think some of the linemen that Patriots defensive linemen have been facing, even on what is the first team, are guys that may or may not make the team. So again, to see at all levels, right? Because it's not even the third string guys they're going against even further down than that. So to see them at all levels against, for lack of a better term, a more appropriate level of competition, I think will be helpful. I do want to go back. Sorry, no, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was going to say it would be interesting to see if we see Shaq Mason on Thursday.
Oh, I forgot he's in Houston now. That will be Christian Barmore, Shaq Mason. That was a fun matchup there one year here. I remember that they had a couple one-on-ones, so that'll be interesting to see. I do want to go back to the offensive side of the ball because you did mention Demario Douglas, and if as many starters sit as we think are going to sit, I think the biggest storyline to follow going into this game is the competition that's emerged between Demario Douglas and Tyquan Thornton for that fourth wide receiver spot. Now, Thornton, after a rough camp, he had a good day today. So trending in the right direction heading into the preseason game. That's encouraging. But Douglas is a guy who, to this point, has checked every box you could want him to check. That doesn't mean he's won a job or anything because there's still 2 weeks of box checking to go, but he's good in the non-padded practices. He was good in the padded practices. He's handled contact well. He's handled an increased role well. He's meshed with Mac Jones as he's moved up to that top unit. This is another big box for him to check. And for Tyquan Thornton, a guy who had a good preseason last year before he got hurt, it's a chance to kind of steady himself and reestablish himself. I would think Thornton's going to play. I know some of the, when I say veteran, like non-rookie receivers are expected to sit out. I think Thornton's going to play, but to watch these two guys and how they attack this game, I think is going to be maybe the most interesting storyline we get Thursday night.
I think those two, and I think Booty as well,
yeah.
who's had some momentum building in camp. It seems like he's had a catch a day too that has caught one's attention. And the thing about all three of those guys, to me, is there are the physical characteristics they have that separate them from some of the other young receivers. I know a lot of people every year on social media, when the media reports what we see from training camp practices, talk about the hype train of this guy or that guy.
Yeah.
And I really believe, like, when you look at these players, there is something about each one of them physically that's different than some of the guys that were productive this stage of training camp in the past. And it's unfair to single out like a Trey Nixon, for example, who was kind of one of the early stars last spring and last summer before the first preseason game. You watch Demario Douglas. I mean, the quickness and the open field shiftiness and elusiveness, and then as well that acceleration, that burst that he can show you after a catch, that we haven't seen in a while here. Thornton has the speed straight down the field. That's something they really don't have from any of the other receivers. And in the case of Tyquan Thornton, I think it's imperative for them to get him going. And I think you're right. I think he's got to play on Thursday. And I think Booty kind of has impressed me too with a little bit of his first step acceleration and some of the burst that he's shown of lane, in addition to making some great catches. And by his own admission, starting to get comfortable, starting to get the rhythm of this offense. So I think those are three guys that really bear watching closely on Thursday night from the receiver position, who can bring to the Pats something they really haven't had in that last one or two receivers, in that grouping, I think, in the recent past.
I think a big question a lot of people want to know too is if Kayshon Boutte starts having a big game, are you ready for the puns Zoe's going to start making?
I guess she does. I've had a couple of people tell me the last couple of days, a couple of very notable and well-respected journalists say, Bob, are you ready for the Boutte? Can I say it? A Boutte call on Thursday night? It's so I'll let Zoe go there. That one has Zoe on it, not me.
All right, there's a couple more guys I want to mention here before we kind of wrap it up. But to me, this game is going to be, and we sort of talked about a lot, it's going to be about the rookies. Christian Gonzalez, I feel like, has sort of gotten lost in the rookie conversation in a good way. He's looked so good to start camp that when we talk about, Keon White's proven this, and Marte Mapu's proven this, and Demario Douglas is starting to do this, Gonzalez kind of gets lost because we all sort of expected him to step in right away and be an NFL player. And it's looked like he's done that. But how much do you think he has to prove in a game like this? What are you expecting from him? Or do you think there's a chance he gets the veteran treatment? And I don't think he'll sit out entirely, but maybe only plays a handful of snaps.
Yeah, I would hope that he plays. I wouldn't expect him to get the veterans treatment yet. And I think it would be a very interesting test for him, depending on, whether the Texans play some of their expected starters. Now, Robert Woods isn't the most blazing fast receiver, but he's an excellent route runner and a very good veteran, a real pro at that position. I'd like to see some of these young kids go up against him, because the Texans, they have to find out whether CJ Stroud is ready to go for week one. You mentioned he's going to play at quarterback for them. And I think there's some school of thought that, if he's not ready, then Davis Mills will be the starter ahead of Stroud, and they'll ease him in. But they're giving him the chance to compete for the job. And to me, that means they got to get some guys on the field that can help him and really allow them to gauge whether he's their starter from day one. So I would expect, Nico Collins, Robert Woods, players like that for the Texans to be involved in this game. Not that I've studied them closely. I know Woods coming off injury issues, and we've seen him as a Bill and certainly a very good player with the Rams, but just a veteran with some savviness, somebody that knows how to get open, going up against one of these young guys who might, have those Thursday night lights fever, have some kind of a overzealousness, over anxiousness, want to make a play in that first NFL appearance, and that'll be a test of sorts too.
Another guy I'm hoping plays for the Texans is Dalton Schultz, the tight end that they recently signed, because, and it relates to another Patriots rookie, they draft Marte Mapu. Two things right away we're looking at him maybe helping the team with. They struggled against mobile quarterbacks. They struggled to cover tight ends. We know CJ Stroud can move around. And then if you get some reps on Dalton Schultz too, he's been in that red non-contact jersey. So I'm kind of tempering my expectations with him in terms of what we'll see on Thursday night. But in theory, this Texans offense, I think, presents a good opportunity to see a couple of different skill sets and where he's at on a couple of different levels.
Yeah, absolutely, Alex. The other thing too is just taking the field in your first NFL game. For young players, I think there's a real value to that. I still subscribe to that belief, even though the trends are that established guys and the guys you expect to start generally don't play in a lot of these preseason games anymore. I think for the first-year players in particular, there's a value to it. How do they handle what it's like when there's substitutions and calls coming in from the sideline? You have to make changes in a game environment where maybe you don't hear the call as clearly as you would in practice, or where maybe you get distracted by what's going on around you in the stadium environment. And to me, I think there's a value to that. Just being out there, lights on, it's a real game, there's real hitting, and you've got to be able to not only hold up physically, but stay focused mentally in what really is a new environment at this level as first-time pros.
There any other players, rookie or otherwise, you're particularly interested in watching Thursday night that maybe we didn't get to?
Well, I'm interested in the safety position. There's been so much talk about Devin McCourty's departure and who is going to take over for him. And I think we know what the Patriots have in Jabril Peppers, Adrian Phillips, Kyle Duggar. But there's some guys back there, like Josh Bledsoe's been around for a couple of years. I don't know, what his status is. I tend to think that he's in a tenuous spot. They've got some of these other guys they've really been working a lot with, I should say, on special teams. And it looks like, Amir Speed, Jordan Heilig could have roles. Mapu really is someone who, to me, fits more with that safety group. So I guess kind of sorting through the numbers at that position, because there are going to be some guys like Brendan Schooler last year who make the team because they're special teams aces in the making. And he's going to take up a roster spot on the back end. So what defensive backs are going to be left behind? Miles Bryant has been so reliable for them in a lot of ways. And I know he's a guy that gets knocked at times because his size, he may not be the best cover corner, but he's been a solid player, very versatile player. He's somebody who really hasn't hurt them. He may not always be able to cover the elite receivers, but he's also a guy that he's not going to make the kind of mistakes that cost you football games generally. And to me, what's his role? Is it the same as it's been, or could there be a challenge to that? Are they just because of the numbers that are back there between cornerback and the safety position?
Bryant at safety is fascinating to me. And this is something I've talked about since the draft, since they added Gonzalez, they built up that depth. I'm like you. I think Miles Bryant probably gets a little too much hate just because he's been played out of position. And he's, to try to clean this up, like Miles Bryant's not a fast player by cornerback standards. And when you ask him to cover the other team's fastest receiver, Isaiah McKenzie, it's just not going to go well. But what Miles Bryant excels at is, one, he's got tremendous processing power. Like, he understands the game, what's in front of him. And for a guy his size, he's incredibly physical. And to me, that's a guy that if you put him back at safety, instead of having him chase somebody, let the play happen in front of him and come to the play and step up and make the play. And we saw him in that role as a rookie in 2020, and I thought he was pretty good. They've got to get him back in that role. They maybe didn't have the cornerback depth to do it in the past, but they do now. And I would hope that he gets to return to a spot that more fits his skill set.
But then you have Christian Gonzalez. But also, here's the thing. You have Christian Gonzalez, Jonathan Jones. I mean, let's assume for now, because we don't know any differently, that Jack Jones is out there. You have Jalen Mills. And we've seen him play in the middle of the field at times thus far in training camp. There's a guy like Isaiah Bolden. They may see enough of an upside in him because of special teams, again, potentially combined with his length and his size, some of the skills that he has physically and athletically, the traits, I should say, that he has. He may be a guy they want to keep around, in one of those last roster spots. So I think, and I mentioned Speed and I mentioned Heilig, they're spending an awful lot of time with those two guys in particular, and they have been from day one in the spring. So they're taking up roster spots. And though there is more flexibility now because of the practice squad, I think it's harder to keep, obviously, someone who has the athletic traits that some of these young players do. to keep them on your practice squad and be able to play games with them to get them on your roster during the regular season, because there's attractiveness to other teams, I would think, for what little I know. So I think they've got some interesting decisions ahead, and these next 3 weeks are going to determine an awful lot back there.
Well, and as it relates to Bryant, the other thing to keep in mind, I always remind people this, because they say, oh, just cut whoever, put him on the practice squad, bring him back when you get somebody on IR. When you're talking about a guy like Bolden or a guy like Speed, especially Bolden, who they've played a lot at corner, and it seems like they may have a long-term plan for at corner. If you cut him, you don't get him back on his rookie contract. You have to sign a whole new contract, and it's usually a 1-year deal. And then you're going year to year. And if all of a sudden he takes off as a corner in year 3, now you have to pay him as an ERFA or as an RFA. And that creates a whole, situation where you could just have him on the 3rd year of his rookie deal, and it could be that simple. So whereas Bryant was an RFA, is on a 1-year deal, if you cut him and bring him back, there's probably a little bit, I don't have his contract details in front of me, there's probably a little bit of dead money involved, but it's not, it doesn't have the long-term implications of cutting somebody like Heilig or Speed or Bolden, where you're essentially burning that rookie contract. Before we wrap it up here, Bob, I want to ask you, just on a personal note, so let me preface this by saying, I can't imagine it's easy to prepare for an NFL game in general, but a regular season game, you have, 11 starters on offense, 11 starters on defense, a handful of players elsewhere, but it's pretty much one unit that's going to carry you through the game. You're going into this game, you've got 90 players on both sides. You're essentially going to see 2 or 3 different units on each side of the ball for both teams. What is the process like for you preparing for a game like this? Does it in some ways feel maybe like more of a task than preparing for a regular season game?
Well, yeah, for a number of reasons. For one, not only is it the volume of players that you have, but as you well know, when we see them in practice, Malik Cunningham is wearing number 64. When we see him on Thursday night, he's going to have a different number. So you start to identify these guys. Oh yeah, that's Bolden 63. That's Speed. He's 61. Now you have to learn the new numbers when they go out there, and try not to confuse them with the numbers the previous Patriots who were in those jerseys had. I'm going to have a tough time looking at Anthony Jennings and not think Jawan Williams. I'm going to Mac Wilson and not think Jabril Peppers.
I've been doing that all camp.
I think I get separate Jabril Peppers and Brian Hoyer. In number 5. But so there's that part of it. You mentioned the volume of players. And again, you when you build your charts, at least the way I do, I try to build them the way the depth chart looks. Well, the first string and the second string are largely irrelevant in preseason football, at least the first game anyway. So now you're working further down. Your charts are a lot more cluttered. The charts are big cheat sheets. In my case, I do them on poster boards. And I'll have the Patriots offense versus the Texans defense on one side, the Texans offense versus the Patriots defense on the other side. And so it becomes a lot more cluttered. And you really don't, the way we do the broadcast too, Alex, it's not the kind of telecast / radio broadcast, they're both it's simulcast, that you're accustomed to hearing. There's not a lot of play-by-play. It's more conversational. But you still have to, at times in the middle of a conversation or a point that Zoe is making or a question that I'm asking, now you've got to identify who's out there. And there really hasn't been time to study the Texans very much. I'm still trying to learn the Patriots. There's no video to watch from the previous week. It's not just for the players. It really helps a lot during the regular season. First of all, you know who a lot of the guys are on the other team just by sight.
Right.
You're familiar with the Dolphins players. You're familiar with the Eagles because you watched them so much last year, and there haven't been that many changes. Well, now in this game, all of a sudden, there's a 4th string, 5th string running back who's out there for the Texans, and you didn't see him go into the huddle because you're talking to your partner, and you're going back and forth, and all of a sudden, he pops free down the right sideline, and you've got to try to make the call. I mean, I can go on, and I don't mean to be too technical, but there's a lot of challenges to preseason games that you don't really have to overcome in the regular season, because not only are the numbers of players greatly reduced, you're more familiar with them, and you're also in rhythm. You're locked in calling play-by-play. You're setting the down and the distance and the time and the score, snap after snap after snap, and you really get into the flow of it. In this case, you're talking to your partner about roster position battles, maybe going to studio to Paul Perillo, maybe bringing in the McCourties, who are now doing the twin cast, of course, an alternative, or I like to say complimentary broadcast to what we're going to present on 98.5 The Sports Hub and WBZ, CBS4 in Boston. So there's a lot going on.
He is Bob Socci, and he will have the call on Thursday night of the Patriots and the Texans, the preseason opener. So, Bob, thanks for taking a break from your preparation to join us and talk Pats today.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks for having me.
Now, I'm Alex Barth, 985thesportshub.com. More content up on the website. I'll be back after the preseason opener, probably at some point on Friday, to break it down. So until then, thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.